Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3.
But I'm not seeing any audio.
Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3.
Never mind.
All right, Jen, I can hear you
I
on.
can see your audio now.
I can hear you on Zoom.
You are, in fact, coming through live right now.
Awesome. Thank you. Just making sure that I can hear you guys on Discord. I can't hear myself on Discord, though. I can't hear myself in the video, unless it's just me being dumb. Yeah, I can. I can. My bad. I'm sorry. He's trying to get on Zoom, but he said he's having some issues real quick. Understand.
Well, there is audio coming out of the stream, but I don't know what it is. Can you not hear audio on the stream?
Yeah, I could. My bad. 1 second. Let me see. Kind of issues. Maybe I can help. Let me see if I can edit this meeting. Security. I don't want to lock the meeting. No, I don't want to lock the meeting.
Yeah, he's coming. He's coming through. I can hear him on YouTube, so I don't know what you're talking about.
Enable waiting room. Why is this happening? Yeah, I know that. Let's see. That's cool. Highly confused. Let's see. Okay. Aha. Hello. How are you doing today? Sorry about that.
Hi.
Yeah, I think what happened was that I had some strange, like I'm not very familiar with Zoom. I usually use like Discord or Google Meets. So I think there was some sort of verification thing it was having pop up.
Yeah, it was strange. It insisted that I log into my account first before I could get into your meeting, and I've never experienced that before. So it took me a while to figure out what password they wanted and where. And
sorry
anyway,
about that.
That's okay.
Yeah, I had some similar issues with I had an AMA scheduled with Dr. Dorfield this past week, and Discord was making him have to verify. And he sent me a message. He goes, "I guess I'm just too dangerous for Discord."
Yeah.
Um,
Was that was Jay Garfield, was it?
yes, sir. Yes, sir. Dr. J. Garfield.
Okay. All right. Look, first of all, don't call me sir. Graham's fine. Okay.
Got you. Sounds good. All right. Well, I guess I can go ahead and start off by again emphasizing I appreciate you for taking the time out of your day to be here today.
You're welcome.
And it's very helpful for me, especially I'm a philosophy student here at the University of Mississippi, and it's um, epistemology and Eastern philosophy. A lot of those things are very relevant to my studies, especially since I want to write my thesis statement regarding sunyata and some of those things. And I really appreciate it again. And I just want to start out by giving you a chance to maybe talk about yourself a little bit if you think that that's necessary, or if there's anything you want to introduce yourself as, or
Oh, well, no, not really. I'm just a philosopher. I'm Australian, but I've worked in New York about 10 years now, and I work in a whole bunch of stuff: uh, logic, metaphysics, history of philosophy, some Asian philosophy. Um, yeah, that's it.
all right, sounds good. Sounds good. Yeah, I it's not necessarily related to philosophy, but I have a lot of favorite bands that are from Australia. I think Powderfinger is one, and Silverchair is one, and I'm really big fans of those.
Yeah, look, to be honest, I haven't really kept with pop music since my kids grew up. So I know the Australian bands of the 70s and 80s, but I'm a bit out of date.
Nothing wrong with that. I guess I can get to some of the questions now that I find to be particularly interesting. I had some submissions that I verified because I didn't want people just sending random sort of questions that you never know what you get these days. Um, so I guess I'll start with the first question. And what are your views on the mind-body problem in philosophy?
Yeah. Look, let me ask you a question first. Who am I talking to?
Um, I
Well,
am.
when you answer a question, you always take things for granted. What can I assume? I mean, are the people in your audience philosophy students? Are they lay people, or are they sort of, who's out there?
Yeah, I got you. So we have a mixture, kind of philosophy students and people who are just interested in amateur philosophy, street epistemology, things like that. Some undergrad students, but for the most part, most of the people on my server, people who listen to me, they are not very experienced with philosophy, including myself. I'm not very experienced with it myself. Of course, I'm an undergrad, so I find these AMAs and whatnot to be very, very helpful. They were really helpful for me whenever I was trying to kind of get a grasp on, especially with some of the jargon, and I find them very, very educational. So,
Okay. All right. So that gives me something to work on. Look, the mind-body problem is a very old problem in philosophy. It tends to hit Western philosophy after the scientific revolution. I don't think you often find it before that. I don't think you find it much in Eastern philosophy. And it's about the relationship between the corporal body and the mind. And of course, that's only a problem if you think that those two things are distinct. If you don't, then there's not a problem of what the relationship is between them. What there is a question of how the things we call mental experiences and events relate to the body. And I guess if you want to categorize me, I'm a physicalist. So I don't think there's anything more to people than their bodies. And I think that mental attributes are essentially the way that the brain, the central nervous system, and some bits of the other bits of the body function. Now, a lot of people think that view is counterproductive or counterintuitive, shall we say, just because they don't see how something physical could produce, raw feels or, phenomenal consciousness. But I don't know that I find that a real problem. I mean, there's a question about how, you know, motions of atoms produce heat and electronic discharges produce lighting. I mean, that's just the way it works, it seems to me. So, to sum up, I guess I'm a physicalist, and I've never really felt the force of the problem that some people have felt with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that one. My friend who asked that is a physicalist, and he likes to run arguments by me a lot of times, and I'm sure he really appreciates that.
I mean, there's this thing called the hard problem, which you and some of your friends may have run across, which is how um, the body could possibly produce phenomenal experiences. And I guess I've never really felt the force of that. I mean, it's often motivated by some kind of thought experiment, which I find, um, very implausible.
Yes, sir. With that, that relates to qualia as well. I would assume, like they
Yes.
say with
Yeah, raw fields, consciousness, qualia. They're not exactly the same, but they're in the same ballpark.
Okay, absolutely. um, and let's see, I'll go to this. Do you have any advice that you would give to students that are interested and passionate in teaching philosophy? That's one that's very relevant to me because I'm kind of in my come up years, I'd say, like where I'm in my undergrad and I'm still, very uninformed when it comes to a lot of things, which again is why I have these AMAs. But I eventually want to get down the line where I can get my master's, and then eventually down the line, if I am not exhausted, I'd love to get my PhD and then instruct classes in philosophy in the same way that a lot of people have taught me.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for those people?
Well, look, the entrance gate into the profession, the philosophy profession, is to get a doctorate. You're not going to get a job in the profession otherwise. So if you want a job in the profession, then you've got to aim to get a doctorate. So you've got to aim to get into graduate program, and for that, you've got to get good grades and be able to write some decent philosophy if you're a writing sample. And then when you get there, you've got to, you know, write a good doctorate, try and get it published or parts of it published. So, I mean, the general advice is just do the best philosophy you can, and if it's good enough, that'll get you through. But the only place where you're going to get paid anything to teach philosophy is in the profession, and professional philosophers don't get paid that much compared with bankers or lawyers or whatever. Um, but if you love teaching philosophy, there are other places you can teach philosophy. You know, a lot of grade schools now teach philosophy. Often libraries put on courses in philosophy. You can run reading groups yourself, and so there are things you can do to teach philosophy at a non-university level. And if you love teaching, as some people do, you might want to think about that. But as I say, the only place you're going to get paid salary to do it really is at a university.
Yes, sir, absolutely. Thank you so much. Let's see. Sorry about the sir. It's a habit of mine. What are your thoughts on Kripke's rule-following paradox?
Yeah. So the rule-following paradox is that we tend to think that when we follow a rule, our actions are determined in some sense, either by the thoughts in our minds or implementing objective rules of some sense, or meanings, or the story goes many different ways. But what Wittgenstein argues in the investigations is that none of these things really is sufficient to determine our actions. And that strikes most people, I guess, as rather strange. To the extent that Wittgenstein has a solution in the investigations, it's that in the end, it's just a matter that of after a certain kind of training, that's what you're inclined to do. He says, somewhere in the investigations, something like explanation's got to come to an end somewhere, and I'm inclined to say, when I hit bedrock, then this is just what I do. My spade is turned. And I kind of think that Wittgenstein got it right there. I mean, there are a lot of intervening steps that what you do is mediated by a few things. But in the last analysis, I think it's that you, by being sort of the kind of person you are and I am, we're all sort of similar biological creatures. After an appropriate kind of training, we just find it natural to go on that way. But you asked about Saul's solution. To the extent that I understand Saul's solution, I think he's pretty much got. I think he pretty much endorses Wittgenstein's solution. Of course, all these things are contentious, and people don't like Saul's account of Wittgenstein, and people may not think that Saul's account is exactly Wittgenstein's. When it comes to exegesis of Wittgenstein, there's an enormous amount of disagreement. Okay, so the things I said might be controversial amongst Wittgenstein scholars and Kripke scholars, but that's, for what it's worth, that's my reading of it.
All right. What are your views with respect to absolute philosophical nothing and empty worlds? Do you have any comments on free logics in relation to emptiness?
Well, the first thing that I'd want to say is that this word nothing is ambiguous. The most obvious meaning for someone who studies in philosophy is it as a quantifier. So, like some, all, many, most, no, something, many things, most things, no things. Of course, quantifiers don't refer to anything. To say there's nothing there of a certain kind is just to say, well, there's no thing of that kind there. Could there be an empty world? That is a world where there are no things? Yeah, sure there could. That's a logical possibility as far as I can see. Normally, okay, let's not go into technical details too much, but normally logic makes an assumption there's got to be something there, but that tends to be for simplicity. And we know how to do without that assumption. It's a kind of simple assumption, but there are ways around it. So that's the word nothing as a quantifier. Now, the word nothing can also be a noun phrase, and that's not so thought about by logicians and metaphysicians. But when you say, or someone might say, God created the world out of nothing, that's not the same as saying there's no thing such that he created the world out of that, because that's consistent with God not creating the world. If he didn't create the world, he didn't create the world out of something, right? So when you say God created the world out of nothing, you mean he created the world out of nothingness, and nothingness is a noun phrase. And that's a very puzzling object, because almost by definition, it is no thing. That's the quantifier, because it's what remains when you've removed everything. But it is something, because after all, you can talk about it, you can think about it, you are now. So at least prima facie, it's a kind of paradoxical thing. Actually, my own view is that's exactly what it is. It's a paradoxical object. It's something which is both something and nothing. Now, of course, I hold the view that some contradictions are true. That's not a view that a lot of people would agree with in the current profession, but it's my view. And over the last 30 or 40 years, people have attacked a lot of paradoxes using that kind of idea. paradoxes of reference, paradoxes of motion, Sorites paradoxes. I mean, if your audience doesn't know what they are, that doesn't matter too much. There's just a whole bunch of standard paradoxes. And usually when philosophers or logicians have addressed these, they've tried to find something that's wrong with the paradox, some argument that doesn't work or premise that isn't true. But at least for some of these things, I think you just bite the bullet and say, yeah, the argument works, you're dealing with a contradictory object. And that's what I'm trying to say about the paradox of nothingness. Okay. As a matter of fact, I'm sort of writing a book on that at the moment when I can find time to do it. So that might be the next book down the track.
Yeah, I'm very interested in hearing about that. Actually, we and my friends, we talk about Sorites paradox a lot, with relation to utility specifically. How just because you can't use the idea of a heap of sand, just because you can't prove that the heap is an actual thing, doesn't mean that if a bulldozer is about to dump a heap of sand on you, being committed to the idea that there's no heap is not useful in that instance.
Correct. I mean, virtually all the language we deploy, maybe outside of mathematics, it's vague. So there are going to be borderline cases, and what you say about borderline cases is always contentious. But I'm inclined to think that in the borderline case, so suppose you've got a Sorites transition from, I don't know, say red to blue, say red to not red, okay? Then what's the status of the color of things in the middle? And some people think, well, there's a precise cutoff line, so there's really no borderline case there, people like Tim Williamson. Some people think that in the borderline case, to say that it's red and not red or not red, both of those are neither true nor false. I'm inclined to think it's both. Those are both true or false, but there's really no consensus on that in the profession. This is, still hotly debated.
Sir, thank you. How do you think? What are your views? Sorry, is there a is metaphysical modality intelligible? I can't talk today.
Yeah. I'm not persuaded there is such a thing. I mean, people come up with examples of things which are metaphysically necessary but not logically necessary. Things like, a standard example is you couldn't be the person you are unless you had the parents you did. And there are various intuition pumps that people use to think, oh yeah, that's got to be right. I couldn't have been that kind of person. And that's obviously not a logical truth, right? There's nothing logically necessary about it. I've not really persuaded by these intuition pumps. So I'm not very persuaded by the arguments to the effect that there is a distinctive notion of metaphysical modality. And I've written about that and explained why. And again, it's not the standard view, but it's my view. Come to think of it, a lot of my views are pretty non-standard, but that's where the fun is.
What do you think of Hegel's interpretations that argue his ideas about contradictions are consistent with the law of non-contradiction? If you have any thoughts on that.
I don't think he does. I think Hegel's a dialectist. He thinks that some contradictions are true. Now, again, that's not the orthodox interpretation of Hegel, but the orthodox interpretation of Hegel is people who've sort of drunk the Aristotelian Kool-Aid and bought the law of non-contradiction. And you only got to read Hegel to see that he doesn't. He says things like, so in the logic he says, look, to be in motion is not to be here at one point of time and here at another point of time, but to be both here and not here at one and the same time. Now, that's literal. He says it in German, but the translation is exact, right? Now, he endorses a contradiction. If you read the text, Hegel was a dialetheist, someone who believes in true contradictions. So there's a movement abroad in Hegelian interpretation nowadays by some of the younger Hegelian philosophers who haven't drunk the Aristotelian Kool-Aid. Okay, and I actually think they get it right. I agree with their interpretation.
What are your thoughts about normativity? Is it irreducible, or is there some other view you take?
So I interpret your question as meaning something like this. Suppose there's a norm. Norms are of many kinds. They can be moral, legal, rational, logical, let's suppose. But they're usually going to be of the form, you ought to do such and such, whether the ought is legal, moral, rational, blah, blah, blah. I think such claims are true or false. Sometimes in the not so distant history of Western philosophy, people have said, no, they're neither true nor false. But I don't think that's right for various reasons. And in the end, I don't think you can reduce the truth of these things to anything else. Sooner or later, any way of cashing out the truth of these things is going to find itself using normative discourse, and that's fine. Why should you require it to be something else to be intelligible? Bishop Butler said, everything is what it is and not another thing. And if you try and reduce everything to kind of some kind of Procrustean bed, you're going to go astray somewhere. So I guess that's my view.
So is there, in your view, a right type of logic? That might be a kind of a weird question, but
yeah. Well, look, what you're talking about is something that gets called logical pluralism in the discussions in the literature, and that's been a big issue in the literature now for 20 years. So crudely, you can summarize logical pluralism as the view that says there's more than one kind of logic that's right. And that claim can be interpreted in many ways, depending what you take right to mean. And it could plausibly mean many different things. I'm not talking about just different views of rightness, but it can be right as a pure mathematical system. It can be right as an applied mathematical system for a particular application. But usually, when the rubber hits the road, right means giving you the correct answer about an inference. So if you say to me, look, Donald Trump is corrupt and Donald Trump is not corrupt, so pi is rational, is that inference valid? Okay, different logical theories are going to give you different answers. And I'm inclined to think that there's a uniquely right answer to that question. So in that sense, I'm a logical monist. Now, I'm not going to go to the wall over that if there are good arguments otherwise, but as a matter of fact, I've never found arguments about that I find. I've never found arguments for logical pluralism in that sense that I find persuasive.
This is a question for me. Do you have a response to presuppositional apologetics specifically, and where do you think they make the biggest leap?
Can you explain to me what you mean?
Oh, are you familiar with presuppositional apologetics?
No.
Oh, okay. So it is essentially a style of apologetics from Christians that will say that God is the preconditions for all logic and possibility, and they will say that He instantiates. Yeah, it's very similar to a transcendental argument for God.
Well, I'm an atheist, so I'm going to say no.
Yeah.
So I want to see an argument for the fact that, first of all, there is a God of some kind, and of course, people believe in lots of different kinds of gods. So I want to see an argument for the existence of the God in question, and then I want to see an argument that the validity of an inference depends on God. I've never thought much about this issue, but off the top of my head, I can't think of any arguments I would find very plausible.
Yeah, that's very similar to my response. I think that that's just a massive leap as it is. How do you generally think about skepticism and skeptical objections?
Well, look, if someone really is a skeptic, then there is nothing you can say to persuade them otherwise. Because any argument you give them is going to have premises. And if they really are a skeptic, then they're just going to say, well, I don't see why I should accept that premise. I don't see why I should accept the conclusion. And they're always going to say that, right? So in a sense, you can't, if someone really is a skeptic, you cannot persuade them otherwise. However, the history of philosophy notwithstanding, I don't think anyone really is a skeptic. Aristotle says, look, if you really are a skeptic, well, if you're hungry, you'd eat broken glass instead of food. Or when you want to go to Megara, you'll just as well walk off a cliff. And I think he's pretty much right about that. And Heidegger put it in a very different way. We are embedded in the world. We're thrown into the world. We have to behave. We have to act in a certain way. And you don't really get any choice about that. So because we're thrown into the world in this way, it's really impossible to be a skeptic unless you want to die. You say, oh, I don't know. Okay, I'm going to walk out in the street and I don't believe the bus is going to knock me down. Bang, gone. So I don't really think anyone can be a skeptic. Except as a kind of philosophical debating position. I guess to the extent I have a view, it's that.
Understood. Currently, there are a lot of people in the Discord community. It's basically where my server is located, is on the Discord platform. There's a lot of people who will say that their starting point for their epistemology is cogito ergo sum. Yep. And do you have any thoughts on that?
The cogito?
Yes, sir.
Don't call me so. It's Graham, okay?
Graham.
Look, it's a valid inference. So is I run, therefore I exist. So is I'm having breakfast, so I exist. So it's not the validity that's interesting. It's the premise, cogito, I'm thinking. All right. That premise has been subject to criticism ever since Descartes came up with it, because it presupposes there's an I. Okay. So this is a very old objection that was put to Descartes by, I think, Princess Elizabeth. And I think that's pretty much right. Okay, so that's the first thing. Second thing is, let's suppose that you do know that you exist. How do you infer anything else? Descartes tries to infer everything else, including, his scientific principles from that. It's complete failure, of course. Even if you are sure that you exist, it's virtually impossible to get anything else out of that. So as a reply to skepticism, even if it does establish that you exist, I don't think it's going to get you very far. So I guess as a solution to skepticism, I don't think it's going to fly.
All right. Thank you, Graham. um, R.T. Mullins has this idea that one can appeal to skeptical theism, except in the case of a contradiction. On dialetheism, this exception wouldn't be warranted. So, how do you approach arguments about God from that view?
Same way as I approach any other argument. See if the premises are true, see if the inferences are valid. If it is, accept the conclusion. If it isn't, don't. Or at least suspend judgment.
Yeah, I understand.
I mean, I'm always curious as to why people make exceptions to the law of non-contradiction. And the person you quoted isn't the only person that does that. There's a contemporary French philosopher, Meillassoux, whose shtick is that everything is possible. He's got various arguments for this. I'm not saying they're good, but that's that's what he thinks. He says everything's possible except a true contradiction. He doesn't give any argument for that. He's drunk the Aristotelian Kool-Aid.
I like that phrasing a lot, Aristotelian. What do you take to be the relationship between pragmatism and Buddhist notions of emptiness or sunyata?
Look, there's no obvious connection. You might try to tie the two things up, but it's going to be a very long train of connections. I mean, emptiness is the view that everything depends for its being on something else. Pragmatism is the view that you should believe something. Look, there are different kinds of pragmatism depending on who you've been reading. Peirce, James, Dewey, some of the British pragmatists. They don't all agree with each other. But, crudely, pragmatism is the view that something is true if it's efficacious in some sense. No. So those are the two views, emptiness and pragmatism. And there's no obvious connection between the two. As I say, you might, by some kind of long chain of argument, try and tie them up, but it's going to be a very controversial chain of argument.
Understood. A friend of mine, Sophie, she wrote and said, I think it's super cool that you engage with Buddhist philosophy in some of your work. Do you think it's important for academic philosophers to include non-Western traditions and celebrate their achievements? If so, do you try to incorporate non-Western and comparative philosophy in the classes that you teach?
Yes and yes. The Eastern traditions constitute at least half of the world's great philosophy. And you've only got to read the text to see that. The people who in the past have held that it's not philosophy, and this was a very common view amongst Anglo philosophers 50 years ago, just hadn't read the text. So if you want to understand not just Greek-based philosophy, you've got to understand these other things. Is that important? Sure, it is. Look, you can specialize in Greek philosophy if you want. You can spend your whole life reading Immanuel Kant if you want. That's fine. But just don't pretend that you're doing anything more than, doing Greek philosophy or studying Kant. If you want to study philosophy, then you should take into account the things that smart people all over the world at all times have said. Because, Anglo people or European people are not smarter than Indians or Chinese or Japanese. That's just, intellectual imperialism. So, yeah, I mean, if you're interested in philosophy, you should be looking at smart people, smart philosophers everywhere. I think it's important for professional philosophers such as myself to include Asian philosophical traditions and topics in what we teach. I mean, I often teach Buddhist philosophy at the Graduate Centre, for example. Have I said enough, or do you want me to go on?
Oh no, you're okay. I was just making sure. Absolutely. Do you think you can comment on the Avicenna contingency arguments? The ones that rely on Aristotelian metaphysics and make the argument that there cannot be like a infinite chain of dependency. So there must be an independent thing which has properties in itself for that property to exist at all.
Okay, look, I'm not familiar with the Avicenna arguments, so I can't really say anything in terms of about those. But Avicenna's working off a generally Aristotelian background, and Aristotle is, at least to put it mildly, highly skeptical of completed infinities. And if you had some kind of regress, that this depends on that, that depends on that, that depends on that, and so on all the way down, there is some sense in which you'd have a completed infinity. I've always found the arguments against completed infinities very unpersuasive. A regress is not necessarily vicious, and we know that from mathematics. Okay, so once you've got a regress, if you want to argue that it's impossible, you've got to argue that it's vicious. And even though some people have argued that a regressive dependence is vicious, I've never found a plausible argument for that. So, I mean, there's a part of contemporary Anglo metaphysics called grounding theory. And it's a standard assumption that any chain of dependence must have a bottom element, must ground out somewhere. But arguments are rarely given for that. And the few that I have seen, I've not found very persuasive. So my suspicion is that I'd be inclined to say the same about the Avicenna arguments.
Okay. Do you have any thoughts on the dialectic between transcendental idealists and transcendental idealists? Or it's transcendental realists. I asked the same thing twice. Sorry.
You mean Kantians and non-Kantians?
How
are we using the word? How are you using the word transcendental idealist here?
I can get some clarification for that question real quick. Yeah. We can go.
It might be a question that counts. It might be a question that's more general. It just depends on what the question means.
I got you. I can move to a different question until I get some clarification on that one. And this one is just, do you have any opinions on the logical problem of evil?
Yeah, I think it's as good a knockdown argument as you can find in philosophy against the existence of a God that's morally perfect, omniscient, omnipotent. Yeah.
Yeah. Kantian transcendental idealism. My apologies, is what the correction was. It was
Yeah. Look, I'm not a Kantian. I think the thought that space and time are simply in the mind is a bit wacky. There is a really hard and deep question, though, about how much of reality is a mental construction and how much is not. And that's a debate you find in so many traditions, East and West. I don't think Kant had the right answer, as I just said. Clearly, some things about reality are conceptual constructions. Societies are, for example, money is. I don't think everything is. I don't think if I walk in front of a bus and get knocked down, I've been hit by something which is a conceptual construction. I've been hit by something hard and real. Okay. So that I think that some things have got to be conceptual constructions and some things haven't. Now, where you draw the line and how you do it, I'm not sure. I think that's a really hard question.
Understood. I have one more question, real quick, and it is: do you have any thoughts on the problem of the criterion?
Can you tell me what you mean?
I think it's sorry about that. I think that he is. I need to be more familiar with these things so I can just answer them probably. um, just waiting on him to clarify. Would you like to take some time to talk about? You mentioned you were writing a book earlier. Would you like to take a moment to like talk about that a little bit, or?
Well, I've already said what it's about. It's about nothingness. And I think nothingness is a really interesting object. In fact, it's a paradoxical object. It's an object that's not an object. I think that brings other contradictions in its wake. It's ineffable, and it isn't. And I think in some sense, it's the ground of reality. Now, that all sounds kind of wacky, and I know that. I think you can make this rigorous and tight with the techniques of non-classical Mariology, theory of parts and wholes. So it may be wrong, but it's not wacky. I mean, it's technically coherent. So part of the book is a discussion of non-classical Mariology to try and show that. And then the rest of it is kind of wringing out the philosophical consequence of this, including a discussion of those philosophers in the history of philosophy who have talked about nothingness. And they are everywhere. I mean, I've got 6 in mind at the moment. One is Dao De Ching, so that's Chinese. One is Meister Eckhart, who's a medieval Christian. One is Hegel. One is Sartre. One is Heidegger. And one is Nishida, who's a 20th century Japanese philosopher. So as you see, the people who've engaged with this question go through space and time. So science is kind of esoteric, but it's one of these things that keeps popping up in the history of all the philosophical traditions I know. Okay, that's the thumbnail sketch. And it won't be ready for at least 18 months yet, because we keep getting sidetracked to do other things.
Thank you so much. The clarification question was, do we start with items of knowledge or a method for determining what counts as knowledge?
Yeah. I suppose if I had to lump for one of those, I'd start with the former. But I'm inclined to think that the dichotomy is probably not the right way of putting things. I mean, as we talked about before, you're thrown into the world. I mean, almost literally, every person is thrown into the world by their mother. Okay, you don't get much choice about that. You don't get much choice about what you believe as a kid. You accept the things you're told. That's the way we learn. In other words, your beliefs start from where you are, and you ain't got any choice about that. What you have got a choice about is how you revise your beliefs in the light of evidence. So that's where rationality comes into it. You don't have to accept the things that you were thrown into the world to believe. You can work on them and hopefully improve on them. But you're always starting from where you are and trying to make things better. Is that a method? Maybe. Is it the fact that we start from given things? Well, in another sense. So maybe I was a bit quick in saying that I accept the first horn of the dilemma. in some sense, I accept both. But I mean, the question kind of presupposes a foundationalist epistemology, that we start from, something certain, the cogito or whatever, and then take it from there. And I just don't think that's true.
With respects to the Munchausen trilemma, do you have any thoughts on taking the horn of infinite regression? Or do you think there's a problem that
Okay.
isn't held?
I haven't heard it called the Munchausen trilemma before, but this is sometimes called the tropes of a Nicodemus. So if you believe something, it must be justified, and there must be therefore something that justifies it, and there must be something that justifies that, and then either something lacks a justification, or you've gone round in a circle, or you've got an infinite regress, and all those are supposed to be bad news, right? Is that the dilemma you have in mind?
Yeah, that's what we were talking about. The infinite regress, or axioms, for instance, or circularity.
Look, I don't think given what's in question, I don't think that it's always going to be the same way to go. I think sometimes the infinite regress is okay. I think sometimes the circle is okay. I think sometimes having a brute fact is okay. I think you've really got to consider every case on its merits. And nice as it will be to have kind of some uniform solution, I think rationality is much more complex than that. And after that, we argue about each particular case. Now, let me say something. I mean, you've asked me a lot of questions, and that's fine. And you've asked what I think, and I told you as best I can. But in a sense, what I think is irrelevant. Okay, if you ask any philosopher, you're going to get different views. Okay, in fact, I believe that it's in a sense neither here nor there. I mean, it's not the views that are important; it's the reasons. And I sort of sometimes I've indicated my reasons, although generally speaking, you haven't asked me much about reasons. But all the questions you've asked me are going to have contentious answers. And so my view is only ever going to be the first move in the game. After that, you think about people are going to disagree and why, and then you're into philosophical argumentation. That's where these things go.
Yeah, I think that's actually that's really good advice to keep in mind for the questions, especially because that is a good thing to point out, is that we have talked about views rather than reasons a lot here today. I guess.
I'm sorry. My views tend to be on many things tend to be somewhat unorthodox. Okay.
Oh, understood.
So most people, I mean, on any of the things you've been talking about, a lot of people are going to disagree. Well, that's fine. Philosophers disagree with each other. That's the way we make a living. But no one's going to believe something simply because I say it, or because Kant says it, or because Aristotle says it, or because Nagarjuna says it. Okay. That's always the first move in a philosophical discussion.
Thank you so much. That's something definitely to keep it.
Merely because your philosophy teacher says it either. Okay.
Absolutely. It's especially down here. I'm in the south part of the United States, so it happens everywhere, but it feels like I've had some very particularly bad experiences down here. But I appreciate you for your time, and I think that what you said just now is very important for me to keep in mind, because I'm still kind of young into getting into all these discussions and questions and reasons, as you said. So in the future, with a lot of these discussions, I'll try to focus a little bit more on the reasoning rather than just asking for somebody's views, because I think,
Yeah.
as you said, that's much more important.
I mean, generally speaking, at this stage, your teachers know more than you. And so that means that they'll have thoughts and arguments that you don't know. So, of course, you should take those on board, consider them. But in the end, there are very few answers in philosophy that most philosophers will agree with. Certainly historically, there's no consensus on most things. So you've got to make up your own mind. And as I say, you respect other people for what they can offer to the discussion, which your teachers certainly can. But the mere fact that your teacher believes something, or I believe something, or that Aristotle believes something, whatever, this is a standard fallacy. There are no appeals to authority in philosophy. It's one of the reasons I love the subject. You can argue about anything.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I will say, Graham Priest. Appreciate you very much. Maybe in the future I can schedule one again when we're a little bit more organized, and it'll be a little bit better.
I look forward to it.
Thank you so kindly.
Okay. Well, good luck with your work, Trevor, and good luck to all the people out there in Zoom land for their work.
Yes, sir. You too.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.